Hi guys, my name is Joanna, and today I wanted to take some time to talk about raising intuitive children. In my practice, I have a lot of kiddos that I see that come in, usually most with struggles kind of related to just sort of managing their emotional experience, some with a lot of worry and anxiety. And I'm not a therapist that really likes to label. I'm pretty holistic, and I see things more in patterns than I do categories. So it's not my natural nature to go and assign clinical labels, especially to children who I feel are just learning to navigate this world. And of course, the brain's developing and they're just learning new skills every day. So it's my tendency to sometimes use terminology, wording that sounds pretty clinical, but to avoid actually giving clinical labels. So what I find is, for anyone that is likely going through their own spiritual awakening or just kind of progressing in their own personal development, whether it's just emotional, professional development, or really actively working on kind of developing their intuitive abilities, it can feel like that alone is a full-time job. Our own stuff is a lot. Just managing ourself, our needs, and the roller coaster of emotions and stressors that we face each day is a lot. To have both the opportunity and the responsibility to be the parent to a child who is also intuitive just kind of adds a whole another layer of busyness. My experience is with intuitive children, they often pop up pretty quickly as being very emotional, very expressive kids. These new waves of children being born are way more perceptive and are really open, or they're born really open to their intuitive gifts. A lot of children are naturally anyway, but these kids are really coming in on a higher level. So if we see ourselves as being more on a third dimensional level, working up the dimensions like fourth, fifth, just trying to really practice and hone our craft of connecting with our intuition, these kids are born at the level that we're trying to acquire. So that is a lot, and it's a lot for these little people to manage the input and the awareness and the feedback that they're getting every day. So it's not surprising as adults that we get overwhelmed, that these little ones would also get really overwhelmed. And the environment of right now isn't necessarily the most supportive of really emotional folks. It's a pretty brain bloated culture with a really high focus on, rules and just rationality. So these kids can get pegged pretty quickly as being problematic, but in fact they're gifts. I am a parent, and actually all three of my kids are intuitive, and it's a lot, and they're little, but it's pretty evident. I can tell, and I've actually just in my own life sought guidance and coaching on how to be the most supportive parent I can be to them. They're all different in their abilities and their needs and their personality. So, true to any parenting, you have to parent the child that was given to you, not the child that you wish you had, and to really learn to tailor your approach to the specific child. So each child might just require a different parenting style from you. So when dealing with empathic or intuitive children, I really did some research, not just talking to people who are or do identify themselves as being intuitive, and to talk about their experiences growing up, but just even in the work that I do with these kids right now, have just some really general recommendations on how to be supportive to them. And the number one thing really that got reinforced over and over and over is the need for them to feel like they can communicate to their parents. The need for them to feel like they are heard and listened to, acknowledged, and that their emotions are important to their parents. And this can be hard because they are wired to feel a lot. So what in our adult brain seems like a very small thing can be a very huge thing for them. And our tendency as parents is to have this desire to shift all our kids, from a state of stress into a state of calm. And so sometimes our responses, though intended to be helpful, can actually shut down communication with them, because we might try to problem solve, rationalize, or even minimize the stressor to help them move through their discomfort and kind of get to a brain level thinking place. And by doing that, we sometimes disqualify and invalidate and minimize their actual emotional experience, and that for them is extremely hurtful. And if it happens one time or multiple, sometimes they just stop communicating, and that's when things go off track. That's when I see these little ones kind of get into difficult spots because they don't know what to do with their emotions, and they're not actually really communicating them or seeking assistance. And so it kind of comes out sideways, is what I say. It can come out in avoidance behaviors, it can come out in emotional meltdowns, it can come out in regression in their behavior, or all of a sudden they seem to be kind of like going backwards with their maturity level or their skill level, because they're stressed. They might start to exert control where they feel they have it, and so it can come down to kind of behavioral stuff, where they're not actually necessarily behavioral, and they're not necessarily experiencing anything that's really a mental illness. It's just they're stressed and they just don't know what to do, and they're not talking, and so they're just kind of managing the way that they feel like they can, which is going to be a very childlike level. So that being said, if you find or you suspect or you know that your child is intuitive and have intuitive abilities, don't fear. You don't have to share the same ability level. You don't have to understand every experience that they have. Less is more, in the sense that sometimes just being that person that they can talk to, and you can just be present and listen without judgment and without minimizing and without problem solving, can be extremely validating to them and very supportive, and very comforting. So that can be difficult. There was an analogy that was given to me one time and that I thought was really helpful. It was about sometimes we are capable of so much. Like, the analogy was like, let's say you're a gourmet chef and you are capable of making the most fabulous, complicated, best tasting meals, and you have all of this desire to do this greatness, and someone kind of belly ups to the counter and all they want is mac and cheese. That can be hard because we still might push and be like, well, hey, I can do this salmon, I can do this really great, specialized dish, and all they want is mac and cheese. So it's the same thing with kids. Sometimes all they want is for you as a parent to listen to them and to validate them. And when I say validate, what I'm really referencing is using language that shows that you are attending to their emotionality. So that's saying, hey, I can tell that you're really sad about that, or I can tell that, you're really scared about that. Validating an emotion does not make them more anxious, more sad. It actually creates the opposite effect. So sometimes people are really avoidant of doing this, but this actually is effective in any relationship. And you've probably had it too, where you've had a strong emotion. All you wanted someone to do is reflect that they get that you're feeling that way. And that itself can be soothing, and that can actually bring down the level of emotion in a person. It's just saying, yeah, I can see how that would be really stressful for you, or I can see how you might be really worried about that, without a but. So no, I know you're nervous, but it's just a reflective statement, and you sit in the space with them. You just sit in their discomfort. And what you'll notice is most people will start to calm down, and when they're able to calm down, they can shift out of that emotional space. So this is really important with any heightened reaction for anyone, but especially with, I think, children who are intuitive and really empathic. If they're experiencing a lot of emotion, that isn't a time to problem solve. It's a time to hold their hand, comfort them, and offer statements that shows that you get it. And you might have to do this for a little while. You might have to spend a couple of minutes in this space. You might have to offer several statements of just reflecting like that you understand where they're coming from. And the more specific to the emotion you can get, the more that's going to resonate with them. Meaning, instead of just saying, yeah, that's hard, try reflecting what it is you think they're sensing. So if you feel like they're anxious, or if you feel like they're scared, reflect that specific emotion. Like, hey, it seems like you're scared about that. If you're wrong, you're still right, because they're still going to feel like you're attending them, and they'll actually possibly give you more feedback. So they might say, no, I'm not scared, I'm nervous, or no, I'm not scared, I'm really sad. And then you have a better idea of where they're actually at, and you can use that and you can reflect that. So that's not a fail, that's actually a hit. So it's one of those things I tell people that you can like flub it and it still works, because the person still feels attended to. They're not focusing that you named the wrong emotion. They're focusing on the fact that you're actually trying to resonate with them in their emotional space, and that's the part that's meaningful. So never be afraid to try it. Again, it's something you can totally mess up and is still going to be helpful. It's not too many patterns and skills that you can do that and it still kind of pans out for you. So that, I would say, is probably the most critical item in communication, is validation, validation, validation with these children. When you start to notice that they are calming, the other thing I encourage is, instead of telling them how to problem solve, I encourage you to ask questions that lead them to problem solving. So you might say something like, yes, sounds really hard. I can see that maybe you're feeling a little bit more calm. Is there anything you think you can do that would be helpful with this? And let them try to switch on their thinking brain themselves. If you offer up a suggestion, one, they're not practicing that themselves, and two, they might just bat it away. But generally, if we think of something ourselves, we're more inclined to follow it, and kids are no different. No one really likes to be told what to do. But it's actually a really skill building thing you can do as a parent, is to help children learn to manage their emotionality and then kind of pivot into thinking mode and move forward and move through what's happening. So you're not feeling responsible for kind of shoving them out of sadness or out of anxiety and fear. They're able to do it themselves. They just will likely need some coaching, and you will need to do this over and over and over and over. So little children, really under the age of 4, don't have a strong or consistent ability to regulate emotion. So I find that intuitive children tend to be, from birth, if not in utero, stinkers. They have a lot of emotionality, they fluctuate a lot. Some have a lot of fire in their being and are just come out kind of colicky maybe, or just really saucy and sassy from birth, and that's okay. Like, that's okay. It's hard to parent, but that's okay. They're fighters, and these kids tend to be the advocates for others, so they're leaders. But raising leaders can be hard, because obviously they don't tend to always follow direction. They're not always compliant. It's not necessarily their thing. They have a high level of integrity. So unless something really resonates as being important or truthful or genuine or congruent with what they believe is right, they're not going to do it. So these kids can take a lot of energy in trying to help parent and navigate, and sometimes we have to do a lot of personal reflection and personal work and kind of manage our own crap, to be honest, when dealing with them, because they're really going to challenge you. They're really going to challenge you to grow. I know that my kids, my oldest is only 3.5, and then I have a 2-year-old and a baby, but these kids have challenged me on a core level that no other experiences have provided. So I am challenged greatly to learn to be patient, to slow down, to really reflect on the reasoning that I'm doing things, because they can easily activate. Their emotionalities, if we're tired, can seem ridiculous, and so we just need to be really mindful of monitoring ourselves as parents and engaging in self-care so that we're in a okay spot so that we can be more a resource to help these little ones. The goal with these little ones is that they stay open. In one of my prior videos I talked about that a lot of empaths, especially ones that are adults now, had a lot of experiences that caused them to kind of disconnect and shut down, is what I call it, from their intuitive abilities. They had a lot of pain, and so their intuition and that flow of information is something that either scared them or created a lot of hurt, and so they kind of just moved away from those. But these kids coming in now, these little ones, are really critical. We really need them, and they're meant to stay open. And so I have learned, even in my own work, that one of my roles when these children pass my doorway is to really resource them with ways to understand what's going on in them, and how to manage the flow of emotionality, and to really normalize that, because even little ones as young as 5 already feel like they're different and that something's wrong with them because they're different. And so I really help explain what's going on, and I give it, names, and I just talk about the fact that they're really empathetic and they're really sensitive, and that's actually a wonderful gift, because they're able to see and understand where other people are, but that's going to be really hard for them because they might find that makes them different, or they might get confused, or they just might get really stressed and overwhelmed at times, and that's okay, and that even though that's really uncomfortable, they can learn tools so that they're not feeling as stressed and uncomfortable. And we talk a lot about ways to self-soothe. Intuitive kids tend to be very, very sensory based, so it's likely really important for them to have time in nature, to be active, to move. You might notice that they gravitate towards certain sensory activities. I have some kids that are really tactile, so they might have like squishies, or they just love to create things with their hands. I have many that are artistic. And some that I can't tell you how many are actually in OT, occupational therapy, not because there is anything inherently broken or wrong with them, but actually I really find that the way life is structured, including schools, don't offer them the level of movement that they need to be integrated and to be in a calm space. These kids need a lot of movement. And they need a lot of sensory input, and schools are just, for the most part, like, we're really here in the States moving away from activity. Like, kids, recesses are going away, playtime's going away, and that is so critical to any child. That's how they learn. That's how their brain grows, is through the stimulation. And it's the opposite. We're just kind of, in a lot of schools, just lining them up in different classrooms, just sort of desk to desk, and that overwhelms kids. So it's not uncommon that intuitive children seem to struggle with school, not always necessarily the academics, but sometimes more the environment. Like, it's just not an environment that is always supportive of them, because they might be really kinetic, which means they learn by doing or moving, or they might get overwhelmed by the amount of energy in a space, and because of their sensory stuff, sometimes they get really overwhelmed by sensory input. Intuitive kids are often very auditory sensitive, and so they get overstimulated and overwhelmed, and they just sort of emotionally crash in these places because their bodies are just not built to filter that input out, and it overwhelms them. So as parents, you're always encouraged to look at whatever opportunities for schooling, any other schools, charter schools, STEM schools, homeschooling, whatever you want to do, even if you have a great public school that you feel is accommodating to your child. Like, I really support you in doing that, or requesting accommodations at school to allow for this, because these kids are amazing, and they have lots to offer, but they just have a lot of emotionality and need a lot of support and coaching to help them as they age learn how to manage that flow. And if you think about it, a lot of adults don't even have that skill. So if you yourself as a parent don't necessarily know how to do that, I encourage you to really start to learn yourself, because you're modeling. Kids will do what you are doing, not what you tell them to do. And so as a parent of intuitives, it's really important that you be comfortable with emotion, because if you're not able to even own your own, your children won't. They will see that and they will sense that, and they will learn that maybe emotions are negative and they won't talk about it. So as a parent, I invite you to be really honest with kids about what's going on with you. You don't have to emotionally dump on them, but if you're having a hard day or you're feeling stressed, you can tell them that, like, I'm kind of feeling stressed today, but I'm okay. You don't need to worry about me. So a real general statement, kind of reflecting where you're at emotionally. It also helps them know that's not about them, because they tend to internalize that. But without details, so they don't need to know that your boss yelled at you, or you're worried about money. You don't need to give that level of detail, but you can let them know kind of what space you're in, and by doing that, you allow and you encourage and you facilitate them actually doing the same. So if they're in a negative spot, they can actually tell you, and if you're in a receptive mode when they tell you, and you can validate how they feel, and show interest and just be present with them, that's huge. I cannot tell you how important that is and how critical it is. And that was like the number one thing I've seen with kids here in my practice, but also in just kind of surveying empaths and intuitives, like what was the thing that you needed. And the people who felt like they did the greatest are the ones that felt like they had a strong relationship with their parents, and the ones that really struggled really felt like they weren't understood, or were teased, or they were just sort of labeled as being oversensitive, and so their experiences were minimized, and they really learned to stop talking, and then not talking is more problematic than the emotional diarrhea that might come out of their mouth. I know that it can get overwhelming to be the person that that's happening to, when your child's just sort of like seemingly over responding. But again, they're tuned to be really emotional, and so it's not their desire to be that uncomfortable. They don't like that state either. They just don't know what to do. So some other things to consider is, I often encourage, make a list, a written list. You can use pictures if a little one can't read, and talk about, when they are in a calm state, things that they can do to settle down and to soothe. Again, most of these kids, some element of nature is really important, whether it's being outside, animals or pets, rocks, like whatever it is, sensory stuff, like hanging in a hammock, burrowing under quilts or blankets, whatever they already naturally tend to do. Like, really talk about the purpose of that, encourage them to turn towards those activities. Electronics are not a self-soothe, so if a child is struggling, or even an adult, it's really important that we're doing things that calm down our sensory system, our nervous system. And when we do that, we are able to actually shift emotional states, and usually it can kind of help with any sort of worry loops going around in the brain. So common things that I recommend for kids is stuff like Legos, or putty, or squishies, or just playing, like imaginative play, coloring. I'm really prone to anything tactile, like anything using the hands. If they have like a blanket they love, that's great, or stuffed animals, or petting their animal, listening to music. I've even taught little ones how to meditate, and they tend to be really awesome in follow through, actually. They are really open, sometimes more so than even adults, and taking this feedback and trying things. So I've been really impressed with some little ones, like, when you have an 8-year-old who's like meditating, it's pretty cool. So don't be afraid to, again, be present with them in their emotionality, knowing that that actually helps them to calm on their own, and then to ask questions, leading questions about how they think they can resolve what's going on, for them to help practice settling down and shifting emotional states, and then going into sort of a more rational state to kind of manage what's going on. And that's a huge skill base that will help them forever. And you being present and just listening to them is really rapport building, and it's really comforting for them. So it's sort of the mac and cheese. Even though you might be able to do way more, that is often the thing they're seeking, and jumping over that is more detrimental than anything. So obviously, like I stated before, all these children are so different. Everyone has their own little personality and background, and so learning to just tailor your approach to what seems to work best for your child is the best thing. There's not one way to parent. It can be helpful sometimes to seek out guidance and counsel from professionals or maybe even other parents, but always know that the feedback is whether or not it's helpful for your child. That's the true feedback. So it might work for Jimmy, and it might not, be something that is a match for Rachel, and that's fine. We just parent the children that they are, and their needs with time grow and they'll shift. And so you'll find that with continued practice and continued coaching that you might see them start to really manage themselves on a different level. But it does take time, so I encourage you to be patient, and I encourage you to be forgiving, because sometimes it can get really overwhelming to manage the intensity of these kids, and you might find yourself regretting or feeling guilty for maybe not being the most responsive, or perhaps you had a really negative response. And we too are being, as parents, challenged to grow in our own being. So sometimes we just, if you feel like you made a mistake, I just encourage you to circle back to the child and apologize, model forgiveness, model ownership of making mistakes. Perfect parenting does not exist, and it's super critical that with our kids that we model all of these behaviors, that we make mistakes too, and it's okay to go back and say I'm sorry. And then as a parent, as you would want for anyone else, it's important to really kind of reflect for yourself what happened and how to prevent that from happening, so you're not apologizing repeatedly for the same thing over and over, because then obviously, just as you would feel if someone was like punching you in the head, I'm not saying you're punching your kids, but if someone kept doing something to you and then apologized but then did it again, at some point the apology is going to kind of render hollow. So I hope this was helpful. There's not a step-by-step guide on raising kids, as you well know, especially intuitives. It's really an organic thing. Listen to your intuition as parents. You know your kids, and I often, even as a therapist, defer. I always collaborate really strongly with parents and ask them what they know, what they feel, and what they sense, because you as parents are, you're advocates for your children, and you are often aware of things. Maybe you can't always use clinical jargon, or you just have a sense of something's going okay or not going okay. And I always really value that input, as well as the input from the child. So and then for me as a therapist, I always see my role as being kind of a skill builder and really strengthening the bond between a child and their parent, because that is so critical to their well-being long term, and giving parents tools and resources on how to be present with their children and coach them on a day-to-day basis is way more meaningful and beneficial to the child than the time spent with me in session. So it's empowerment, and you can do that in different ways. You can even seek out parenting services on your own just to learn and do your own healing. Take care of you. Put yourself in a good spot. If you're noticing things you don't like about yourself in parenting, don't be afraid to lean in and work on that stuff yourself, so you're not kind of projecting that out in your parenting role on your kids. That role is challenging. That role is meant to make us grow. So it's not uncommon for that to happen. But going into shame or denial is not going to benefit you or your kid. So that being said, love on your child, listen, validate some more, and be present and sit in the ick, as I say it. Really learn to just sit with someone in a negative emotional state, and without that need to fill the space with words, platitudes, or minimize or try to shove your child out of distress. Allow them to pivot themselves so that they can do this ongoing and really learn to navigate life in a much easier way. They're strong. High emotionality is not weakness, that's the opposite. It takes courage. So these kids are very strong. They have the ability and are brave in feeling. And so honor that, celebrate that. They're amazing. We need them. So I thank you for your time, and if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below. Otherwise, have the greatest of days.